In 360 BC, a Greek philosopher sat down to write about a nation so advanced, so wealthy, and so powerful that it seemed to defy the very laws of history. He called it Atlantis. A civilization of concentric harbors, auricalcum-plated walls, and kings descended from the sea god Poseidon himself. And then, in a single day and night of catastrophe, he claimed, the entire island vanished beneath the waves. For over 2,000 years, that story has refused to die. Explorers have hunted for it in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and even beneath the ice of Antarctica. Empires have justified conquests in its name. Nazi occultists searched for it. Modern sonar teams have scanned the ocean floor for it. But here is the question almost no one asks first: did Plato ever intend for anyone to go looking? Was Atlantis a memory of a real, forgotten civilization destroyed by fire and flood, or the most successful philosophical experiment in human history, a story so convincing that humanity mistook a warning for a map? To answer that, we have to go back to Athens, to a philosopher named Plato, and to the two unfinished dialogues where this legend was born. The story of Atlantis does not begin on a lost island. It begins in a lecture hall in Athens, sometime around 360 BC, with a philosopher named Plato holding a pen. Plato was not a historian in the way we understand the term today. He was the most influential thinker of classical Greece, a student of Socrates, the teacher of Aristotle, and the founder of the Academy, an institution that would shape Western philosophy for centuries. When Plato wrote, he rarely wrote to record fact. He wrote to illustrate ideas, justice, the ideal state, the nature of the soul. And it was within this philosophical tradition that Atlantis first appears, not as a standalone legend, but as a supporting argument inside two dialogues, the Timaeus and the unfinished Critias. In the Timaeus, Plato has a character named Critias recount a story supposedly passed down from the Athenian statesman Solon, who lived roughly 2 centuries earlier. Solon, the story goes, traveled to Egypt and spoke with priests at the temple of Neith in the city of Sais. These priests, according to the account, told Solon that Greek history was incomplete, that far older records existed in Egyptian temples, untouched by the floods and fires that periodically destroyed human civilizations. Among those records was the story of a great war, 9,000 years before Solon's time, between ancient Athens and a mighty island empire called Atlantis. According to Plato's account, Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. It was larger than Libya and Asia combined, ruled by descendants of Poseidon, and organized into 10 kingdoms governed by 10 kings. Its capital city was a marvel of engineering, a central island surrounded by concentric rings of water and land, connected by canals, bridges, and tunnels. The walls were said to be plated with brass, tin, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which Plato described as gleaming like fire. The Atlanteans possessed fertile land, exotic animals including elephants, hot and cold springs, temples dedicated to Poseidon and his mortal wife Cleito, and a navy so vast it could subdue nearly the entire Mediterranean world. But Plato's Atlantis was not simply a utopia. It was a cautionary tale. As generations passed, he wrote, the divine blood of the Atlanteans became diluted with mortal weakness. Greed, ambition, and moral corruption spread through the kingdom. The once virtuous empire became an aggressor, launching a war of conquest against the peoples of the Mediterranean, including a smaller, more disciplined, and more virtuous ancient Athens. In Plato's telling, Athens alone stood against the invasion and, through courage and unity, defeated the Atlantean forces. But the story does not end in triumph. Shortly afterward, Plato writes, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis sank into the sea and disappeared. That is, essentially, the entire ancient source material. Two dialogues, one of them, the Critias, breaking off mid-sentence, unfinished, as if Plato simply stopped writing and never returned. No other surviving Greek text from Plato's lifetime or before mentions Atlantis. This detail matters enormously, and it is the first fracture point in the mystery. If Atlantis had truly existed as a rival civilization to the Mediterranean world 9,000 years before Solon, no independent Greek, Egyptian, or Near Eastern record corroborates it. Egyptian temple archives, insofar as they survive or are referenced by other ancient writers, contain no mention of a war against an Atlantic empire. The absence of corroboration does not, by itself, prove Atlantis was invented. But it does mean that from the very beginning, Atlantis exists in the historical record as a single author's account, filtered through a third-hand oral chain, Egyptian priests, to Solon, to Critias' grandfather, to Critias, to Plato. Even in antiquity, opinion was divided. Aristotle, Plato's own student, is reported by later writers to have dismissed Atlantis as an invention, remarking that its creator also destroyed it, a pointed comment suggesting the philosopher believed the story was constructed and then conveniently erased to avoid further scrutiny. Other ancient authors treated it differently. The geographer Strabo, writing centuries later, noted that Posidonius considered it possible such a landmass once existed and vanished, reflecting a genuine uncertainty among ancient scholars rather than unanimous belief or unanimous rejection. This division, between those who saw Atlantis as literal history and those who saw it as philosophical allegory, would echo across the next 2,000 years and never fully resolve. For centuries after Plato, Atlantis faded into the background of Western thought, a curious footnote in classical philosophy discussed by scholars but rarely treated as an active mystery to be solved. That changed dramatically with the age of exploration and, even more so, with the rise of print culture in the modern era. As Europeans encountered the Americas, some began speculating that the newly discovered continents were remnants of Plato's lost Atlantic landmass, or that indigenous American civilizations were descendants of Atlantean survivors. These theories had no supporting evidence, but they reflected a pattern that would define the Atlantis phenomenon for centuries to come. Each generation reinterprets the lost civilization through the lens of its own discoveries and anxieties. The true transformation of Atlantis from philosophical allegory into modern popular obsession came in 1882, with the publication of a book by an American writer and politician named Ignatius Donnelly, titled Atlantis, The Antediluvian World. Donnelly was not a professional historian or archaeologist. He was a former congressman with a talent for synthesis and persuasive writing. His book argued, at great length, that Atlantis was not myth but literal history, a real continent in the mid-Atlantic that had been the cradle of all major human civilizations, from Egypt to Mesoamerica. Donnelly claimed that similarities between pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in Central America shared flood myths across cultures, and linguistic parallels were evidence that both regions had been colonized by refugees fleeing the sinking of Atlantis. Donnelly's book was a sensation. It went through multiple editions and directly shaped the emerging genre of what would later be called pseudo-archaeology, the practice of interpreting archaeological or cultural similarities as evidence of a single lost supercivilization, rather than as the result of independent human innovation or later cultural contact. Modern archaeology and anthropology have overwhelmingly rejected Donnelly's specific claims. Pyramid building, for instance, developed independently in Egypt and Mesoamerica, separated by thousands of years and entirely different construction techniques, materials, and religious purposes. Flood myths are common across many unconnected cultures, partly because floods themselves are common, catastrophic, memorable events, not necessarily because of a shared ancestral catastrophe. Yet Donnelly's framework, search for surface-level similarities across unrelated ancient cultures and attribute them to a single vanished mother civilization, became the template that Atlantis theorists would follow for the next century. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw Atlantis theories multiply and, in some cases, take a darker turn. In Europe, particularly in Germany and Austria, a strand of occult and racialized pseudo-history began linking Atlantis to theories of a supposedly superior ancient Aryan root race. Writers such as those associated with the Thule Society speculated about a northern, often Nordic-located, version of Atlantis, sometimes called Hyperborea or associated with Thule itself, from which a master race had supposedly descended before dispersing across the globe. These ideas fed directly into Nazi ideology in the 1930s and 1940s. The Ahnenerbe, the SS-run research institute tasked with providing pseudoscientific justification for Nazi racial theory, funded expeditions and research explicitly seeking evidence of Atlantean or Nordic Aryan origins for the German people. This is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Atlantis myth, a philosophical allegory about hubris and moral decay. Twisted across 2 millennia into a tool for constructing a racist and ultimately genocidal ideology. It stands as a stark historical lesson in how easily unverified legend, dressed in the language of lost history, can be weaponized. Alongside these darker distortions, a separate and far more scientifically grounded line of inquiry was developing. In the early 20th century, archaeologists working in the eastern Mediterranean began uncovering the remains of the Minoan civilization on Crete, a sophisticated Bronze Age society with monumental palaces, advanced plumbing, vivid frescoes, and extensive maritime trade networks. In the 1930s, the Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos proposed that the eruption of the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, around the mid-2nd millennium BC, might be connected to the decline of Minoan civilization and could have inspired the Atlantis legend passed down through Egyptian and Greek oral tradition. The Thera eruption was catastrophic by any measure, one of the largest volcanic events of the ancient world, generating tsunamis, ash fall, and possibly climatic disruption across the eastern Mediterranean. Marinatos's excavations at Akrotiri, a Minoan settlement on Thera itself, beginning in 1967, revealed a town buried and preserved under volcanic ash, remarkably similar in some ways to Pompeii, frescoed buildings, multi-story houses, drainage systems, evidence of a sophisticated urban society frozen at the moment of catastrophe. The Thera hypothesis gained significant scholarly attention because, unlike Donnelly's Atlantic continent theory, it did not require inventing a landmass unsupported by geology. It proposed instead that a real, verifiable Bronze Age catastrophe, filtered and exaggerated through centuries of oral retelling between Minoan, Egyptian, and Greek cultures, could have supplied the raw material Plato later shaped into his philosophical narrative. It is important to state clearly, as responsible historimembers do, that the Thera-Minoan hypothesis remains a hypothesis, not a settled fact. Many classical scholars maintain that Plato's Atlantis story shows every sign of being a constructed philosophical device, deliberately designed for his dialogues rather than a garbled transmission of real Bronze Age history. They point to the internal purpose of the story within Timaeus and Critias, illustrating the corrupting effects of power and the virtue of a disciplined, well-governed state, mirroring Plato's own political philosophy as expressed in his most famous work, the Republic. The specific numbers Plato provides, 9,000 years before Solon, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, are, to many scholars, hallmarks of exaggeration typical of moralizing legend rather than a genuine historical account, even a corrupted one. Historians who favor the allegorical reading also note that Plato routinely used the same narrative device elsewhere, origin myths and mythic depictions of a virtuous, disciplined Proto-Athens designed to embody his political ideals. Meanwhile, geologists and marine archaeologists note there is no evidence of any large landmass having existed and disappeared in the Atlantic Ocean during the timeframe Plato describes. Plate tectonics and oceanic seafloor mapping make such a sudden, total continental disappearance effectively impossible within the last several thousand years. Despite this scholarly caution, the 20th and 21st centuries saw an explosion of proposed real-world locations for Atlantis, each reflecting the geographic and technological obsessions of its era. Some researchers pointed to the Canary Islands and the Azores as remnants of a larger Atlantic landmass. Others focused on Cyprus, Sardinia, Malta, and the Iberian Peninsula, especially the marshy region near Dinana National Park in southern Spain, where satellite imagery in the 2000s revealed circular geological formations that briefly generated headlines suggesting a possible Atlantean layout. Those subsequent geological surveys attributed these formations to natural processes rather than any ancient constructed city. Still others pointed to the so-called Bimini Road, a linear rock formation off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, discovered in 1968 and popularized by psychic Edgar Cayce's earlier predictions that Atlantean ruins would be found near Bimini. Geological analysis has since demonstrated that the Bimini Road is a naturally occurring formation of beach rock, fractured along consistent geological fault lines, not a man-made structure. Perhaps the most extreme reinterpretation came in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, when some theorists proposed that Atlantis was actually Antarctica, before continental drift or before an ancient pole shift supposedly relocated the continent to its current position beneath the ice. This theory requires rejecting well-established plate tectonic timelines that place Antarctica in a polar or near-polar position for tens of millions of years, far outside any timeframe compatible with human civilization. It remains firmly in the realm of pseudoscience, unsupported by geological, glaciological, or archaeological evidence, though it continues to circulate in popular media and documentary programming. Modern oceanography and marine archaeology have, ironically, made it easier than ever to test Atlantis claims and easier than ever to rule them out. Sonar mapping, satellite bathymetry, and deep-sea submersible technology have surveyed vast stretches of the Atlantic seafloor for purposes entirely unrelated to Atlantis: oil exploration, telecommunications cable routes, scientific research into plate tectonics. None of this extensive mapping has revealed evidence of a sunken continent-sized landmass with architectural ruins consistent with Plato's description. Actual underwater archaeological discoveries do exist around the world. Sunken cities such as Thonis Heraclean off the coast of Egypt, submerged due to soil liquefaction and gradual sea level change and rediscovered by archaeologist Frank Gaudio in 2000, or the submerged Neolithic settlement at Pavlopetri in Greece. These genuine discoveries demonstrate that coastal settlements absolutely can and do become submerged through earthquakes, tsunamis, and gradual geological subsidence. But none of them match the scale, location, or timeframe Plato describes for Atlantis, and none has been independently linked to his account through verifiable archaeological evidence. So where does this leave the mystery, more than 2,000 years after Plato first set down his pen? The most historically responsible answer is a layered one. It is highly likely that Plato was working within a well-established Greek literary tradition of using invented histories to illustrate philosophical arguments, and that the core structure and moral purpose of the Atlantis story, a virtuous, disciplined ancient Athens defeating a corrupted, over-ambitious empire, was his own philosophical construction, tailored specifically to the arguments he was making in Timaeus and Critias about the ideal state and the dangers of unchecked power. At the same time, it is plausible, though far from proven, that Plato drew inspiration from a genuine memory of Bronze Age Mediterranean catastrophe, the Thera eruption, the decline of Minoan civilization, distorted and transmitted across centuries of Egyptian and Greek oral tradition before reaching him. The truth may not be a single answer at all, but a blend, a real seed of catastrophic memory, reshaped almost beyond recognition by the deliberate hand of one of history's greatest philosophers. What makes the Atlantis legend endure, generation after generation, is not the strength of any single piece of evidence, because the physical evidence, examined honestly, simply does not exist. What endures is the story structure itself, the idea of a great civilization, more advanced than our own, destroyed not by an external enemy but by its own moral failure. That idea speaks to something recurring in human psychology, the fear that progress and power, unchecked by virtue, inevitably invite catastrophe. Every era has found its own reflection in that warning. 19th-century industrial societies saw in it a caution against unchecked material ambition. 20th-century nations, having witnessed 2 world wars and the invention of nuclear weapons, saw in it a warning about technological hubris. And the legend was, tragically, distorted by 20th-century extremists into something Plato never intended, a claim of racial superiority rather than a warning against arrogance. Atlantis, in the end, may be less a lost place than a mirror. Whatever Plato's true intention on that afternoon in Athens more than 2,000 years ago, he created something far more durable than any city of concentric canals and orichalcum walls. He created a story that each generation returns to, asking not just where Atlantis was, but what its fall was meant to teach, and whether, in the end, any civilization is exempt from the same quiet arithmetic of ambition, corruption, and consequence that he described sinking beneath the waves in a single day and night.